name's Joy Carter, Professor Joy Carter, and I have the pleasure of being Vice-Chancellor of this university and of welcoming you all this evening. So, just a few words from me by way of introduction, and the first is this, that we are thrilled to welcome back leading animal welfare campaigner and our dear friend and strategic partner, Professor Philip Lymbery, and indeed his colleagues from Compassion in World Farming. Philip is the Chief Executive of Compassion in World Farming. He's also one of our visiting professors, and we're really delighted about that. We are, as you know, living in extraordinarily strange and complicated times for a whole variety of reasons. There are hugely pressing and difficult challenges facing society, but not just society, facing the planet and facing all life as we know it. Here at the university, we're passionate about helping to tackle big issues in whatever small way we can. We're driven by our values, and for those who don't know them, let me tell you what they are. We have three core values. One of them is compassion, and that's for the planet and for all life. Another value is spirituality. I think we're the only university in the UK, possibly even in the world, that has spirituality as a core value. And it's a very inclusive value. We say we celebrate our Christian foundation, we welcome those of all faith and none, and we say together we seek to understand the mystery of life and grow in wisdom and love. And if that's not what universities should be about, I don't know what they should be doing. And lastly, our value is individuals matter. And when I say that, people immediately think of human beings, but of course it's not just about human beings at all. Individuals matter. This is about life. Everywhere in this university, we hope you see values in action, and nowhere more so than in our commitment to animal welfare. We're very proud of our University Centre for Animal Welfare. It undertakes research. It offers undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in animal welfare and related fields. It convenes seminars and conferences, and indeed it holds events like the one this evening. So now let me tell you about our speaker. Our speaker is an extraordinary person. Philip has been an animal welfare campaigner and activist for decades. He's worked at Compassion in World Farming for over 20 years, and as I said earlier, he's now their chief executive. But there's so much more to him. He is an award-winning author, ornithologist, naturalist, photographer, and animal advocate. Philip's talks are always illustrated by wonderful photographs, and most, if not all of them, are taken by him himself, including this beautiful one here. His talks are worth going to just to look at the pictures, let alone all his wonderful wise words. Philip is a recognised thought leader and visionary. He's shaping the future of food and the future of this planet. Philip's lectures, speeches and appearances take him right across the world. In terms of what we're here to talk about this evening, perhaps nobody is better placed to comment. He's played a leading role in many major animal welfare reforms, including lots going on in Europe, and that includes many things. Just one example, Europe-wide bans on veal crates. He spearheaded Compassion's engagement with over 1,000 food companies worldwide, and he's led to improvements in the lives of over 2 billion farm animals every year. That's an awful lot of farm animals who have benefited, Philip, from your work, which is wonderful. I'm sure it's more than that. I mentioned he was an author, and I can't resist waving some of his books at you. His first one was Farmageddon, listed as one of the Times Books of the Year. Here is Farmageddon in pictures, which is a bit more my level. I can recommend this to you. And this is another one here, Dead Zone, These will be for sale outside afterwards. This isn't really an advertisement, but the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think these are some of the most influential books of our times and some of the most important. You must read them. His findings in this book, Dead Zone, inspired the world's first Extinction and Livestock Conference, which was held in London in October 2017. It was hosted by Compassion in World Farming, the World Wildlife Fund, and, I'm proud to say, with input from the University of Winchester as well. Philip, they haven't come to hear me, they've come to hear you. So in a moment, I'll be quiet and invite you up here. But let me just say again, you are respected around the world for your work. I know how busy you are. It's a huge pleasure and a privilege to have you with us this evening.
Thank you all for coming out to talk about a much discussed topic, Brexit. And I have to say that despite it being in all of the headlines and on everyone's lips, the big question is, how's it going to turn out? Are we going to have a hard Brexit? Are we going to stay in the customs union? Will there be a Brexit at all? Will we actually press the nuclear button on the 29th of March to leave the EU? Well, the answer is, I don't know. If you've come to the lecture tonight to find the answers out to those particular questions, then you're probably here at the wrong lecture. But I want to talk about what Brexit means, whether it be hard, whether it be customs union, whether it be none at all. What it means for animals. Is it going to be the big break, the thing we've all been waiting for, strewn with opportunities, or will it be an abject disaster? I know from the reputations of many politicians that are caught up in that goldfish bowl called Westminster, it must feel like a fair disaster to them, with Punch and Judy politics rife and the left hand not being able to move the right hand forward. But what I want to talk about is how Britain actually has today and is likely to continue to have huge influence over the lives of many, many millions of animals and people and the environment, not only in this country, but across the world. And this was brought home to me on the various forays that I've done across the world, not least in Sumatra. When I was in Sumatra, I had a film crew with me. And if you've got a film crew, then the locals, they swarm out like magnets. They want to show you everything. And there was this particular day when it was really brought home to me how we affect continents out of sight and often out of mind. When I was asked to go to a village. The village that night had been raided. As soon as I got there, the police were there, and the villagers were telling me, we're scared for our children. What if they come back and we're not here to protect them? What will happen? You see, a raider that night had come out and ripped the side out of one of the houses, one of the wooden houses, to steal food, some rice, particularly good rice from the region, before sloping back into the forest to make a getaway. When I delved further, I found that the raider was none other than a critically endangered Sumatran elephant who was raiding that little village out of sheer desperation because his and his herd's homeland is shrinking because of palm oil. And we know all about palm products for processed foods. That's well documented, and well done Iceland for taking it out of their food. But what's not so well known is that palm products are also used as animal feed. They're imported particularly into the European Union, the UK, and fed to cattle, beef and dairy cattle on factory farms. And this in a land like Britain, where we have so much grassland. And it really brought home to me those long tentacles of what I call factory farming, the keeping of animals confined and feeding them on grain. And it's something which many, if not all of you in this room, will be to some extent at least familiar with, where farm animals like laying hens are taken out of bushes and woodlands and put into cages so small they can't stretch the wings. That happens in Britain a lot. Where pigs, sows that would give birth to their piglets in great nests on woodland edges, are taken out and put into farrowing crates, where they can't even turn around for a month at a time and made to face the wall. Where cattle are taken out of those grasslands. And remember that we're a rich agricultural land. 70% of our entire landscape in Britain is farmland, and of that, 2/3 is pasture. Yet increasingly we're seeing cattle, ruminants, herbivores, taken indoors into mega dairies or into feedlots that emulate those in the USA, where instead of being fed grass, they're fed grain. And you know, the great irony is that there are some in the farm livestock industry in Britain, some politicians who will have you believe that these standards are great British standards. These standards are the best animal welfare standards in the world. The fields have been emptying for decades now, and the animals going into factory farms. But it's not just farm animals that are disappearing. Wildlife too is disappearing. It used to be that just about every farm in Britain had a breeding pair of barn owls. Now it's 1 in 75. Skylarks, that much revered songster, is in steep decline. Once common species like tree sparrows, grey partridges, turtle doves, that were once ubiquitous across our farmland, have disappeared by more than 90%. They've effectively been wiped out. It's not just in Britain, this is something that's happened Europe-wide. And it's really interesting to look at Poland, a country that came into the European Union not so long ago actually, 2004. Poland is famed for having more white storks than any other country in the world, a quarter of the total global population. And these are real sentinel species, a real canary in the coal mine. And it was feared that when Poland joined the Union, that agricultural intensification would drive the species out. And within 10 years, the population of Poland's white storks had declined by 15%, and in the most intensive part of the region, in the west of the country, white storks had declined by 40% in just 10 short years. In Britain and across Europe, it's not just birds. Mammals too have been declining. Hedgehogs have halved in Britain since the turn of the century. And on continents far away, wonderful iconic species like jaguars and the whole network of ecosystems that live with them are being wiped away to grow crops, soya, maize, and other crops, largely to feed factory-farmed animals. Most of the soya that's grown in the world, actually, isn't being grown to satisfy the rampant appetites of surging veganism. It's actually to feed factory-farmed animals, many of them in Britain and across Europe. Bees too. A third of our pollinators are declining at a frightening rate. We've got about a quarter of the pollinators that we need for the proper pollination of our crops in Britain. It's a similar story across Europe, in America, in India, wherever you look, pollinators are declining, despite the fact that we need them for the very existence of a third of all our food. But perhaps even more worrying than that general collapse of the natural world is that our soils are disappearing. The very earth that we need for for our food. The United Nations has predicted that if we carry on as we are, and industrial agriculture is a major driver of soil declines, if we carry on as we are, we've got 60 harvests left in our soils before they're gone. And then what? In Britain, Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for DEFRA, for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, estimates that we have about 30 to 40 years left in our soils. And really what is happening is being driven in a big part by what I call the two sides of factory farming. The first side is the one which we're so familiar with. It's where the animals are caged, crammed and confined, which looks like a space-saving idea, doesn't it? But actually isn't, because you've taken them off of pastures, out of woodlands, off marginal lands, and what we then have to do is use vast tracts of relatively scarce arable land elsewhere to grow their food, their feed. And we do that in an industrial way. Field fields that get bigger and bigger. And as those fields get bigger in this industrial model, so the trees disappear and the bushes and the hedges. And then the chemicals come in. And the flowers and what some call weeds disappear, along with the insects that are needed by the birds, the bats, the bees, and everything else. Even the soils start disappearing, and the worms too. I went to a farm that had 600 acres and not a single worm. Not one. Leaving you with little else but a crop. And then we take that crop and we feed it to those farm animals. And in this equation we then waste, in conversion to meat, milk and eggs, we waste most of the food value, be it in terms of calories and protein. In this way, we waste enough food worldwide to feed an extra 4 billion people on the planet. This is the tragedy, the legacy, the environmental, human and non-human animal impact of factory farming.
Planet Earth, a rich, diverse biosphere of awe-inspiring wonder. Sadly, our incredibly poor management of the natural world is now having detrimental and irreversible effects. And the most damaging of all is the mass production and consumption of cheap meat known as factory farming, a destructive form of farming that is causing devastating damage to our planet.
Factory farming is the ultimate out of sight, out of mind. The animals are behind closed doors, and the meat and milk that comes from those factory farms is labelled in ways which disguise the truth.
Industrial agriculture is the root cause for ecosystems to collapse, wildlife becoming extinct, and huge areas of land and sea lifeless.
It's an underground pipe, I would imagine it runs up there and drops it off.
This is one of the world's biggest dead zones. Pollution is coming from upriver, from industrial agriculture, here into the Gulf of Mexico, and killing it.
Wake up. Time is running out. We have to end factory farming now. Future generations will not judge us kindly if we don't stop factory farming.
You don't see any single farm animal because they are all factory farmed. They live confined in shed and they have really little space. They will never see a blade of grass for all their lives.
Few people realise that there is a direct link with animal extinction and consumer demand for cheap meat. Right now, the world's focus is very much on climate change and how to solve it. However, we must act immediately on another potent threat to life on Earth, which is sadly also caused by us.
So whilst the media and politics is obsessed with Brexit and all of its implications, what's actually happening out in the bigger wide world is that we are facing an environmental disaster. We're facing the collapse of our natural world due, at least in a large part, to industrial agriculture driving across the planet. So, what role has Europe played in this? Is it going to be better if Britain leaves the European Union? Well, I think to answer that question, we really need to trace back the rise of factory farming. And it's a 70-year zeitgeist. You can trace it back to the middle of the last century. And it actually started in the Dust Bowl era, the Great Depression in the United States of America. And it's a great lesson in the law of unintended consequences. Farmers were hard pressed in the Great Depression, and so the government, quite understandably, brought in a whole range of subsidies and support mechanisms to help those farmers stay in business, to help those families stay with livelihoods. And one of the things which that did was stimulate the production of grain. It took the ceiling off the market, having intervention stores where the government would buy surpluses and therefore support the market price. And what that meant was that grains, that cereals, that corn and the like became so ubiquitous, so cheap, you may as well just feed them to animals. And that's what started to happen. The cattle that were ridden around by cowboys on horseback on the Great Plains started to go into fenced areas and then feedlots, and this grain was fed to them. When you scroll on to the Second World War, the trap was really sprung. After the Second World War, the Marshall Plan set of money to help rebuild war-torn Europe. Much of that was used to enable Europeans to buy food from America and then buy the means to produce food. And in that transaction, the means to buy the way of making food. So the new technology, the intensive farm technology started to be taken up in Britain and Europe. And then the seminal moment in Britain was the 1947 Agriculture Act, which essentially enshrined this new zeitgeist of production at any cost, using intensification, blinded to the cruelty. And the European Union in the 50s set off its own common agricultural policy, of course, when Britain joined the Union sometime after that. British farmers have since enjoyed that subsidy regime, which sees 50 billion euros being used in agriculture. That's 40% of the entire European Union budget used to subsidise agriculture. And we can see Poland is a good example that you can't scroll down the common agricultural policy and look for the line which says promote factory farming. There isn't a budget line that says that. But that whole policy regime, that whole subsidy package, nevertheless helps drive that intensification. So what we can see from that is that factory farming is rooted in the middle of the last century. It's 70-year-old thinking. It's not something which is born out of the common agricultural policy in itself. It's actually something that's been spawned by previous generations. And it's up to our generation, I believe, to think again, to recalibrate, because the intensive era was spawned out of problems that were 70 years ago, rather than the problems of today. So let's modernise. Let's become more compassionate, more rational in the way that we produce food. And I think that the whole rethink that's going on in Britain, and to some extent in Europe too, following the whole continually unfolding Brexit drama, gives us that opportunity to say, how should we produce food? How should we farm? Crucially, how should we live? And how should we relate to the living world and to farm animals? But then, what's Europe ever done for animals? We've had this zeitgeist of factory farming. Well, actually, Europe has been a great arena for animal advocates because it means that we can create change, not just in one country, but that transcends, that goes across 28 countries as it stands across the Union. And what are some of those reforms? Well, we got animals recognised as sentient beings, the fact that they can feel pain and suffer. We got that written into law. That was agreed in 1997. We got a ban on the routine tail docking of pigs in 2003. We've got eggs labelled according to method of production. So battery eggs have to be labelled eggs from caged hens, something we've not yet achieved for meat and milk. We've got a ban on veal crates, those tiny premature coffins that the calves lived their entire 6-month lives in, unable to turn around. We've got a ban on the most barren battery cages. The enriched cages are not much better, but hey, we made some progress at least. We've got a ban on the prolonged use of sow stalls where pregnant pigs are locked for months at a time in a static position. And only last year, we persuaded the Union to ban the routine preventative use of antibiotics. Half the world's antibiotics are fed to farm animals, much of it to prop up the factory farming, to ward off diseases of intensification. We got Europe to recognise that that is a serious public health as well as animal welfare issue and to take action. So Europe has been a great vehicle, a great arena for taking out some of the worst systems and practices from the factory farm arena. So how are things today here in Britain, that nation of animal lovers? How much do we care? How much have we changed things ourselves as a nation? Well, the truth is that the majority of farm animals in Britain are on factory farms. In Britain, we have over 700 very large-scale industrial farms, US-style mega farms, and that number is creeping up all of the time, particularly for cattle. And we see animals routinely separated from crops, removed from the land. It's a modus operandi for British and European farming. So, I think one of the big threats from Brexit is that all of that trajectory towards intensification could continue. If there was a no-deal Brexit, which is a possibility, we could all face higher food prices. Tariff barriers would go up, meaning that the prices for food goes up too. And we know that as food prices go up, compassion starts to wobble and go out the window. Britain's food exports could become less competitive for similar reasons, tariff barriers coming up. And if there aren't those tariff barriers, then British farming could be flooded by cheap imports, which could continue and intensify the race to the bottom, sparking off that continued drive towards intensification. In a country in a union where consumers are continue to be hamstrung and blindfolded by labelling, that meat, milk and eggs from factory farms is often labelled as fresh or farm fresh or country fresh, rather than from where it was produced and what it is, which is factory farm produce. We might even in Britain lose that recognition of animal sentience that might not make it into British law once we come out of the Union. We pressed the government hard on that. We've won the battle to persuade the government that it needs to put that in law, and they're committed to it. But the problem is, with Brexit mania, it's getting parliamentary time. So on the positive scorecard, Brexit comes with the opportunity for a new vision, to rethink food and farming, to actually use some of that agricultural subsidy to direct food and farming to a better place. British farmers alone get £3.6 billion worth of subsidy money every year from the Common Agricultural Policy. We don't know yet to what extent the government will continue that into the future, that support for farmers, but there certainly seems to be a receptiveness to the idea of giving our taxpayers' money to farmers in receipt of something, not just for the pleasure of owning land and being a farmer, which is pretty much what it's there for at the moment, but in receipt of something tangible that isn't otherwise rewarded in the marketplace. So higher welfare farmers, environmentally friendly farmers, pasture farmers, farmers that restore wild flower meadows that have long since disappeared, could be supported by a subsidy. And this could be supported in the marketplace by us having a decent shout at buying the things which support a better food culture. So method of production labelling is again something that the government seems to be at least receptive to. If it's factory farmed, put it on the label. It might end up being labelled intensively produced or something of that nature, but at least consumers have got a better shout than if it's simply labelled fresh, which we know confuses a fair proportion of consumers into thinking that that meat or milk is free range, when it isn't. The other opportunity is we could finish off the live export trade. We've done a pretty good job in driving it down over the years. Compared to 30 years ago, live exports are at 2%, 50,000 animals. 2% of historical levels, and that's due to the campaigning work of animal advocates, many of you in this room. Brexit gives us an opportunity to finish off that trade once and for all and stop it from resurging back. I said earlier that Britain has a lot of agricultural land. It covers 70% of our entire country. And of that, 2/3 is pasture. We have an opportunity to rediscover the power of pasture. I think that power of pasture can be summed up best by looking to the Midwest of America at how it was in the days of the bison. In the Midwest plains, bison were dominant. There were 50 million bison roaming in constantly moving herds. And those herds were powered by nothing more than sunshine, rain, and grass. If we were to scoop them up, their combined biomass would be equivalent to the entire human population of North America today. Extraordinary producing power, if you like, from Mother Nature, not a chemical needed. But as we all know, the bison, certainly in those numbers or anything near it, is a thing of the past. There's a few thousand of them now, unless they're on farms, many of them in feedlots. But that power of pasture, that intrinsic ability to grow food in a more natural way, to keep animals in a more natural way, is there. And why not use it? Not just for cattle, but all sorts of other animals too. But wouldn't we be knee-deep in chickens, for example, if we let all the chickens out? Well, I've run the numbers, and what I've found is that we would only need 1 acre of pasture in every 1,000 across the country to keep all of our chickens free range. That's a lot of chickens, but even more pasture. So what we need are farmers that are going to be bold enough to do things in a different way. So who's out there that's doing that? Well, let me introduce you to Tim May from near Basingstoke. Well, what he did was he inherited this large industrial farm. It was an industrial arable farm. It was 10 times bigger than the UK average. And what he found was that he was using £750 worth of chemicals, 9 different chemical applications on every harvest. £750 of chemicals every hectare. And it didn't matter how much he bombed the crops with those chemicals. his yields were going down. His soils were depleting. The wildlife had long gone. So what he did is something extraordinary in that he restored farm animals to their ecological niche as grazing animals, rotating around the farm, interspersed with crops. Not just cattle that are only fed on grass, not a single grain, but also those cattle are followed by the sheep, who are followed by the pigs, who are followed by the chickens. And it works beautifully because the cattle like the longer grass and they nibble it down, they munch it down, and the sheep have shorter grass. And they nibble it right down so that it's really short grass, which is what the hens like. Only sheep didn't do such a good job here. You get the idea. And Tim May really is just one of a new breed of farmers that are recognising that this is the way forward if we're going to restore soil fertility, if we're going to have wildlife flooding back, and it's come back on his farm, and if we're going to have decent food produced in ways which protect animal welfare. So in that new vision of food and farming, what steps can we take that can take us forward? Well, the first is, let's throw off that 70-year-old zeitgeist. Let's stop thinking as if we're in the middle of the 20th century and have a fresh vision. Let's have decent animal welfare standards as a baseline, not the factory farming that prevails today. Let's end the myth, particularly in politics, that somehow factory farming is giving consumers what they want, which is poor quality, high saturated fat food that's destroying the environment and is cruel to animals. Let's give consumers better information so that they can genuinely use their citizenship and their consumerism combined to make decent choices. Let's mend our broken price system. And after all, we know that a price system is broken when poor quality food is cheap and ubiquitous, and decent food is much harder to get hold of and more expensive. We also need to improve farming livelihoods. This is an important thing. Food and agriculture in this country alone is worth £111 billion. Farmers get 7% of the entire pie, and that's part of it. They're squeezed, so the animals are squeezed. Let's unravel that, mend our broken price system so it works for consumers, for farmers, for farm animals. Let's use that public money, our subsidy money, to drive what we want in the landscape. Take a lead with public procurement, buying for hospitals, schools and so on, because at the moment the government's public procurement standards are much lower than McDonald's. And let's also take stock. Less livestock dependent diets. Let's rebalance our diets. We eat far too much meat and dairy. We know that. Studies show that if we reduced it by 30%, we would have a significant reduction in cardiovascular disease, serious cardiovascular disease. We also know that globally, if we continue as we are, eating meat and dairy as we are, then by the middle of the century, our food alone will trigger catastrophic climate change. So the only thing that we know is that if we're going to live a lifestyle which looks anything like the way we live today, that in the coming years, in the short decades ahead of us, a lot has to change, and it begins with our diets. So reducing meat and dairy would be a great way to give us better food, deliver better animal welfare, take the pressure off the hard-pressed countryside. If we halved our meat and dairy production in this country, it would free up an area of arable land that's currently growing oats, barley and wheat to feed factory farmed animals. An area of land would be freed up that is as big as a county the size of Cornwall. We could grow much more fruit and veg, making the job of feeding people so much easier. So I believe that we need that fresh vision, that Brexit comes with threats and opportunities, and that it's down to us to make sure that the Brexit politically obsessed actually listen to the fact that there are much bigger forces, there are much bigger issues at stake, that we need to use Brexit essentially to save our countryside, to stop the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet, factory farming, and to save our country, to save the world for future generations. Thank you very much.